All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Before we get into the book, real quick, what I have displayed on the screen is the answer to the question that Pearl Davis failed to answer in the Anna Kasparian Pearl Davis debate when she was asked about women dying in childbirth. The rebuttal to that question is that the majority of people, the vast majority of people that die at work are men because they work dangerous jobs that women won't do or don't have to, because if the only option for a woman to do a job is a dangerous job where she can get killed, she can just do OnlyFans or get married or do something else, where a guy does not have that option. So yes, men are forced by society to do these jobs where they're more likely to be killed. Or I guess they could just be homeless. You could either be homeless or get killed at work. Your choice, men. All right, let's get into the book here. We're on the New Age 20th Century Pattern on page 862. The decision to use the bomb against Japan marks one of the critical turning points in the history of our times. We cannot now say that the world would have been better, but we can surely say that it would have been different. We can also say, with complete assurance, that no one involved in the decision had a complete or adequate picture of the situation. The scientists who were consulted had no information on the status of the war itself, had no idea how close to the end Japan already was, and had no experience to make judgments on this matter. The politicians and military men had no real conception of the nature of the new weapon or the drastic revolution it offered to human life. To them, it was simply a bigger bomb, even a much bigger bomb, and by that fact alone, they welcomed it. Some people, like General Groves, wanted it to be used to justify the $2 billion they had spent. A large group sided with him because the Democratic leaders in the Congress had authorized these expenditures outside proper congressional procedures and had operated in keeping them from almost all members of both houses by concealing them under misleading appropriation headings. Oh wow, they do that? Majority Leader John W. McCormick, later Speaker, once told me, half joking, that if the bomb had not worked, he expected to face penal charges. Some Republicans, notably Congressman Albert J. Engel of Michigan, had already shown signs of a desire to use congressional investigations and newspaper publicity to raise questions about misuse of public funds. During one War Department discussion of this problem, a skilled engineer, Jack Madigan, said, "If the project succeeds, there won't be any investigation. If it doesn't, they won't investigate anything else." Moreover, some Air Force officers were eager to protect the relative position of their service in the post-war demobilization and drastic reduction of financial appropriations by using a successful A-bomb drop as an argument that Japan had been defeated by air power rather than by naval or ground forces. Okay. See, this is the problem with capitalism, kind of, that people are just vying for power, even to the point where it's like harming society, just so that they don't lose to the other guy. After it was all over, Director of Military Intelligence for the Pacific Theater of War, Alfred McCormick, who was probably in as good position as anyone for judging the situation, felt that the Japanese surrender could have been obtained in a few weeks by blockade alone. The Japanese had no longer enough food in stock, and their fuel reserves were practically exhausted. We had begun a secret process of mining all their harbors, which was steadily isolating them from the rest of the world. If we had brought this operation to its logical conclusion, the destruction of Japan's cities with incendiary and other bombs would have been quite unnecessary. But General Norstead declared at Washington that this blockading action was a cowardly proceeding unworthy of the Air Force. Therefore, it was therefore discontinued. So he just wanted to kill people. Even now, it is impossible to make any final and impartial judgment of the merits of their decisions. The degree to which it has since been distorted for partisan purposes may be seen from the contradictory charges that the efforts to get a bomb slowed down after the defeat of Germany, and the opposite charge that they speeded up in that period. The former charge aimed at the scientists, especially the refugees at Chicago who had given America the bomb by providing the original impetus towards it, was that these scientists, led by Slizard, were anti-Nazi, pro-Soviet, and un-American, and worked desperately for the bomb so long as Hitler was a threat, but on his demise opposed all further work for fear it would make the United States too strong against the Soviet Union. The opposite charge was that the Manhattan District worked with increasing frenzy after Germany's defeat because General Groves was anti-Soviet. A variant of this last charge is that Groves was a racist and was willing to use the bomb on non-whites like Japanese, but unwilling to use it against the Germans. It is true that Groves, in his report of April 23, 1945, which was presented to President Truman by Secretary Stimson 2 days later, said that Japan had always been the target. The word always here probably goes back only to the date on which it was realized that the bomb would be so heavy that it could not be handled by any American plane in the European theater and, if used there, would have to be dropped from a British Lancaster, while in the Pacific the B-29 could handle it. It seems clear that no one involved in making the decision in 1945 had any adequate picture of the situation. The original decision to make the bomb had been a correct one based on fear that Germany would get it first. On this basis, the project might have been stopped as soon as it was clear that Germany was defeated without it. By that time, other forces had come into the situation, forces too powerful to stop the project. It is equally clear that the defeat of Japan did not require the A-bomb, just as it did not require Russian entry into the war or an American invasion of the Japanese home islands. But again, other factors involving interest and non-rational considerations were too powerful. However, if the United States had not finished the bomb project or had not used it, it seems most unlikely that the Soviet Union would have made its post-war efforts to get the bomb. There are several reasons for this. 1. The bomb's true significance was even more remote from Soviet political and military leaders than from our own, and would have been too remote to make the effort to get it worthwhile if the bomb had never been demonstrated. 2. The Soviet strategy had no interest in strategic bombing, and their final decision to make the bomb, based on our possession of it, involved changes in strategic ideas and the efforts, almost from scratch, to obtain strategic bombing planes, the Tu-4, able to carry it. And 3. The strain on the Soviet economic resources from making the bomb was very large in view of the Russian war damage. Excuse me. Without the knowledge of the actual bomb, which the Russian leaders obtained from our demonstration of its power, they would almost certainly not have made the effort to get the bomb if we had not used it on Japan. On the other hand, if we had not used the bomb on Japan, we would have been quite incapable of preventing the Soviet ground forces from expanding wherever they were ordered in Eurasia in 1946 and later. We do not know where they might have been ordered because we do not know if the Kremlin is insatiable for conquest, as some experts claim, or is only seeking a buffer security zone, as the other experts believe. But it is clear that the Soviet orders to advance were prevented by American possession of the A-bomb after 1945. It does seem clear that ultimately Soviet forces would have taken all of Germany, much of the Balkans, probably Manchuria, and possibly other fringe areas across Central Asia, including Iran. Such an advance of Soviet power to the Rhine, the Adriatic, and the Aegean would have been totally unacceptable to the United States, but without the atom bomb, we could hardly have stopped it. Moreover, such an advance would have led to communist or communist-dominated coalition governments in Italy and France. If the Soviet forces had advanced to the Persian Gulf across Iran, this might have led to such communist-elected governments in India and much of Africa. From these considerations, it seems likely that American suspension of the atomic project after the defeat of Germany or failure to use the bomb against Japan would have led eventually to American possession of the bomb in an otherwise intolerable position of inferiority to Russia, or even to war in order to avoid such a position, but with little hope from war to avoid such inferiority. What? This would have occurred even if we assume the more optimistic of two assumptions about Russia. 1. They would not themselves proceed to make the bomb, and 2. That they are not themselves insatiably expansionist. On the whole, then, it seems that the stalemate of mutual nuclear terror without war in which the world now exists is preferable to what might have occurred if the United States had made the decision either to suspend the atomic project, such as an open demonstration of its power before an international audience, in order to obtain an international organization able to control the new power, would probably have led to one of the two outcomes already described. But it must be clearly recognized that the particular stalemate of nuclear terror in which the world now lives derives directly from the two decisions made in 1945 to continue the project after the defeat of Germany and to use the bomb on Japan. This nuclear stalemate, in turn, leads to pervasive consequences in all aspects of the world in the 20th century. It gives rise to a frenzied race between the two superpowers to outstrip each other in the application of science and rationality to life, beginning with weapons. This effort provides such expensive equipment and requires such skill from the operators of this equipment that it makes obsolete the temporarily drafted citizen soldiers of the 19th century and of the armed hordes of World War I and even of World War II, and requires the use of highly trained, professional, mercenary fighting men. The growth of the Army of Specialists, foretold by General de Gaulle in 1934 and foreseen by others, destroys one of the three basic foundations of political democracy. These three bases are: 1. That men are relatively equal in factual power; 2. That men have relatively equal access to information needed to make a government's decision; and 3. That men have a psychological readiness to accept majority rule in return for those civil rights which will allow any minority to work to build itself up to becoming a majority. See, I think that this 3 people are not into 3 anymore. Being ready to accept majority rule in return for civil rights. Okay, that might also allow the other people to bypass you. Okay. Just as weapons development has destroyed the first of these bases, so Secrecy, security considerations, and the growing complexity of the issues have served to undermine the second of these. The third, which was always the weakest of the three, is still in the stage of relative vitality and relative acceptability that it had been in the 19th century, but is in much greater danger from the threat of outside forces, notably the changes in the other two bases, plus the greater danger today from external war or from domestic economic breakdown. So, yeah, economic breakdown makes it so that people don't want to accept majority rule in return for civil rights that will allow minorities to surpass them. Okay, sounds about like where we're at right now. One great danger in regard to the second of these basic foundations, availability of information necessary for decision making, is the impact upon it of the expansion of rationalization. While this has led to automatic and mechanical storage and retrieval of information, it has also led to efforts to establish automatic electronic decision making on the basis of the growing volume and complexity of such information. This renunciation of the basic feature of being human, judgment and decision making, is very dangerous, and its renunciation of the very faculty which gave man his success in the evolutionary struggle with other living creatures. Whoa, all right, I gotta put a post-it note in this because this is ridiculous what he's saying right here. Where he's literally saying that the algorithm is going to make us give up our decision making processes, and that's what makes us human beyond the animals, right? Like we're always talking about, being able to make moral choices is what makes you a human, right? And we're renunciating this factor that was one of the basis of human evolution, basically, and human society. If this whole process of human evolution is now to be abandoned in favor of some other unconscious and mechanical method of decision making, the algorithm, in which the individual's flexibility and awareness are to be subordinated to a rigid group process, right? The blockchainization of knowledge, right? An individual's flexibility and awareness are to be subordinated to a rigid group process. This is what's going on, right? We've got the Democrat view of the world and we've got the Republican view of the world, and you have to choose one. There is no the truth anymore. It's the blockchainization of knowledge. And this was predicted pretty much as soon as they invented computers. That they're going to take away your decision-making ability by taking away your ability to get information. And that people no longer have access. It's not even that you don't get equal access to the information needed to make the government's decisions. Now we're flooded with so much information that people can't even make a decision on which information is true, let alone to make the actual decisions, the hard decisions that governments have to make when choosing between population groups, economic strategies, making war, all these things. A democratic society doesn't work if the people in the society basically don't know as much as the politicians. And because of the algorithm, and the internet is the culmination of all this stuff, right? It's flooded with so much information that now people can't even make a decision. They can't even decide which information to accept in order to make a decision, right? And then, so therefore, the algorithm's coming in and it's going to just take away our decision-making faculties altogether. And then you just get into the blockchainization of knowledge, where now you just choose Republican knowledge or Democrat knowledge, right? And you just accept the block and then you become a Republican, or you accept the block and you become a Democrat. And if you don't accept either block, then you're basically out of the game. Okay. If this whole process of human evolution is now to be abandoned in favor of some other unconscious and mechanical method of decision making in which the individual's flexibility and awareness are to be subordinated to a rigid group process, then man must yield to those forms of life, such as social insects, which have already carried this method to a high degree of perfection. The socialist beehive theory of the Masons, just check that stuff out, where they think that society should be organized like a beehive. And that's kind of how we are with the top 10% men are basically like the guard bees that guard the queen, and then everyone else is an androgynous worker that doesn't have reproductive access. This whole process has been made the central focus of a recent novel, Fail-Safe by Eugene Burdick and Harvey Wheeler. The reduction of men to automatons in a complicated nexus of expensive machines is well shown in that book. To its picture must be added 2 points. 1. It does not require a blown condenser, as in the book, to unleash the full dangers of the situation. It is a situation which is dangerous in itself, even if it functions perfectly. And 2, the avoidance of the ultimate total catastrophe in the book, because a few men at and near the top were able to resume the human functions of decision, self-sacrifice, love of their fellow men, and hope for the future, should not conceal the fact that the whole world in that story came within minutes of handing its resources over to the insects. Regardless of the outcome of the situation, it is increasingly clear that in the 20th century, the expert will replace the industrial tycoon in control of the economic system, even as he will replace the democratic voter in control of the political system. This is because planning will inevitably replace laissez-faire in the relationships between the two systems. This planning may not be single or unified, but it will be planning, in which the main framework and operational forces of the system will be established and limited by the experts on the governmental side. Then the experts within the big units on the economic side will do their planning within these established limitations. Hopefully, the elements of choice and freedom may survive for the ordinary individual in that he may be free to make a choice between the two opposing political groups, even if these groups have little policy choice within the parameters of policy established by the experts. Right? So they make the plan, they make the political decisions, and then you just vote for them. You don't have any say in the matter. You don't have actually any choice. And he may have the choice to switch his economic support from one large unit to another. But in general, his freedom and choice will be controlled within very narrow alternatives by the fact that he will be numbered from birth and followed as a number through his educational training, his required military or other public service, his tax contributions, his health and medical requirements, and his final retirement and death benefits. Eventually, in 2 or 3 generations, as the ordinary individual who is not an expert or skilled professional soldier or a prominent industrial executive becomes of less personal concern to the government, his contracts with the government will become less direct, and will take place increasingly through intermediaries. Some movements in this direction may be seen already in those cases where taxpayers whose income are entirely from wages or salaries find that their whole tax is already paid by their employer, or in the decreasing need for the military draftee to be called to serve by a letter from the president. So, getting rid of the draft. The development of such situation, a kind of neo-feudalism in which the relationships of ordinary people to government cease to be direct and are increasingly through intermediaries who are private rather than public authorities, is a long way in the future. Well, it's not that far now. One consequence of the nuclear rivalry has been the almost total destruction of international law and the international community as they existed from the middle of the 17th century to the end of the 19th. That old international law was based on a number of sharp, rational distinctions which no longer exist. These include the distinction between war and peace, the rights of neutrals, the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, the nature of the state, and the distinction between public and private authority. These are now either destroyed or in great confusion. We have already seen the obliteration of the distinctions between combatants and non-combatants, and between neutrals and belligerents, brought on by the British actions in World War I. These began with the blockade of neutrals, like the Netherlands, and the use of floating mines in navigational waters. The Germans retaliated with acts against Belgian civilians and with indiscriminate submarine warfare. These kinds of actions continued in World War II, with the British night bombing efforts aimed at destroying civilian morale by the destruction of workers' housing, Lord Sherwell's favorite tactic, and the American fire raids against Tokyo. It is generally stated in American accounts of the use of the first atom bomb that target planning was based on selection of military targets, and it is not generally known even today that the official orders from cabinet level on this matter specifically said military objectives surrounded by workers' housing. The post-war balance of terror reached its peak of total disregard both of non-combatants and of neutrals in the policies of John Foster Dulles, who combined sanctimonious religion with massive retaliation wherever and whenever we judge fit, to the complete destruction of any non-combatant or neutral status. Most other aspects of traditional international law have also been destroyed. The Cold War has left little to the old distinction between war and peace, in which war had to be formally declared and formally concluded. Hitler's attacks without warning, the Korean War, which was not a war in international law or in American constitutional law, since it was not declared by Congress, and the fact that no peace treaty has been signed with Germany to the end of World War II, while we are already engaged in all kinds of undeclared warlike activities against the Soviet Union, have combined to wipe out many of the distinctions between war and peace, which were so painfully established in the 500 years before Grotius died in 1645. Most of these losses are obvious, but the others equally significant but not yet widely recognized. The growth of international law in the late medieval and Renaissance periods not only sought to make the distinctions we have indicated as a reaction against feudal disorder, it also sought to make a sharp distinction between public and private authority, in order to get rid of the feudal doctrine of domina, which just basically means domination, and set up a sharp criteria of public authority involving the new doctrine of sovereignty. One of the chief criteria of such sovereignty was the ability to maintain the peace and to enforce both law and order over a definite territory. One of its greatest achievements was the elimination of arbitrary, non sovereign private powers such as robber barons on land or piracy on the sea. Under this conception, ability to maintain law and order became the chief evidence of sovereignty, and the possession of sovereignty became the sole mark of public authority and the existence of a state. All this has now been destroyed. The Stimson Doctrine of 1931, now carried to its extreme conclusion in the American refusal to recognize Red China, shifted recognition from the objective criterion of ability to maintain order to the subjective criterion of approval of a form of government or liking of a government's domestic behavior. The destruction of international law, like the destruction of international order, has gone much further than this. As long as the chief criterion for a state's sovereignty and hence of recognition was ability to maintain order, states in international law were regarded as equal. This concept is still recognized in theory in such organizations as the Assembly of the United Nations, but the achievement of nuclear weapons by creating two superpowers in a Cold War destroyed the fact of the equality of states. This had the obvious result of creating powers on two levels, ordinary and super, but it had the less obvious and more significant consequence of permitting the existence of states of lower levels of power, far below the level of ordinary powers. This arose because the nuclear stalemate of the two superpowers created an umbrella of fear of precipitating nuclear war, which falsified their abilities to act at all. As a result, all kinds of groups and individuals could do all kinds of actions to destroy law and order without suffering the consequences of forcible retaliation by ordinary powers or by the superpowers, and could be recognized as states when they were still totally lacking in the traditional attributes of statehood. For example, the Leopoldsville Group were recognized as the real government of the whole Congo in spite of the fact that they were incapable of maintaining law and order over the area or even in Leopoldsville itself. In a similar way, a gang of rebels in Yemen in 1962 were instantly recognized before they gave any evidence whatever of ability to maintain control or of readiness to assume the existing international obligations of the Yemen state, and before it was established that their claims to have killed their king were true. In Togo, in the following year, a band of disgruntled soldiers killed the president, Sylvanus Olympio, and replaced him with a recalled political exile. Under the umbrella of nuclear stalemate, the boundaries of old states are shattered by guerrillas in conflict, supported by outsiders. Outside governments subsidize murders or revolts, as the Russians did in Iraq, July 1958, or as Nasser of Egypt did in Jordan, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere in the whole period after 1953, and as the American CIA did in several places, successfully in Iran in August 1953 and in Guatemala in May 1954, or very unsuccessfully as in the Cuban invasion of April 1961. Under the Cold War umbrella, small groups or areas can obtain recognition as states without any need to demonstrate the traditional characteristics of statehood, namely the ability to maintain their frontiers against their neighbors by force and the ability to maintain order within these frontiers. They can do this either by securing the intervention, usually secret, of some outside power, or by preventing the intervention of a recognized power fearful of precipitating nuclear or lesser conflict. In this way, areas with a few states, such as Southeast Asia, were shattered into many states went out of existence or appeared as Syria did in 1958 and 1961, and so-called new states came into existence by scores without reference to any traditional realities of political power or to the established procedures of international law. The number of separate states registered as members in the United Nations rose steadily from 51 in 1945 to 82 in 1958 and 104 in 1961, and continued to rise. The difference in power between the strongest and the weakest became astronomical, and the whole mechanism of international relations outside the UN organization as well as within it became more and more remote from power considerations or even from reality, and became enmeshed in subjective considerations of symbols, prestige, personal pride, and petty spites. By 1963, single tribes in Africa were looking towards recognition of statehood through membership in the UN, even when they lacked the financial resources to support a delegation at the UN headquarters in New York City or in the capitals of any major country, and were, indeed, incapable of controlling police forces to maintain order in their own tribal areas. In this way, the existence of nuclear stalemate within the Cold War carried on the total destruction of traditional international law and the gradual loss of meaning of the established concepts of state and public authority, and opened the door to a feudalization of authority somewhat similar to that of which the founders of the modern state system and of international law had sought to overcome in the period from the 12th century to the 17th. All right, the next section is section 17. Section was kind of short. All right. Nuclear rivalry and the Cold War. American atomic supremacy, 1945 to 1950. The factors. The origins of the Cold War, 1945 to 1949. The crisis in China, 1945 to 1950. American confusions, 1945 to 1950. The factors. Historically, the period 1945 to early 1963 forms a unity. During this period, a number of factors interacted upon one another to present a very complicated and extraordinarily dangerous series of events. That mankind and civilized life got through the period of almost 2 decades may be attributed to a number of lucky chances rather than to any particular skill among the two opposing political blocs or among the neutrals. The period as a whole is so complex that no successful effort has been made by any historian to present it as a unity. Instead, it is usually treated as a series of separate, relatively isolated developments, such as events in the Far East, United States domestic history, Soviet domestic history, developments in science and technology, the rise of the neutrals, and other developments. Such a presentation is not adequate because it falsifies the historical fact that these and other developments occurred simultaneously and constantly reacted upon one another. Moreover, the central fact of the whole period, and the one which dominated all the others, was the scientific and technological rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Because this rivalry formed the very foundation and core of the Cold War, which was recognized by everyone to be the dominant political factor of the period. Unfortunately, the Cold War is almost always described in terms which puts minor emphasis on, or which may even neglect, the role of Soviet-American technological rivalry. This is done because most historians do not feel competent to discuss it, but chiefly it is done because much of the evidence is secret. Because of such secrecy, the story of this Soviet American technological rivalry falls into two quite distinct and even contradictory parts. One, what the real situation was, and two, what the prevalent public opinion believed the situation to be. For example, in 1954 to 1955, the Soviet Union had a thermonuclear so-called H-bomb many months before we did, when public opinion believed the opposite. Again, late in 1960, there was a widespread belief throughout the world in a so-called missile gap, or American inferiority in nuclear missile weapons, when no such inferiority existed. And finally, for a period of several years from 1957 to about 1960, the Russians were in advance of the United States and the free world generally in missile technology and in missile guidance mechanisms, although this was not reflected, then or later, in any superiority in nuclear missile weapons because of their simultaneous inferiority in nuclear warheads for missiles and inferiority by a wide margin both in numbers and in variety of such explosive weapons. In dealing with this central factor of the world situation, the historian is prevented by secrecy on both sides from making any assured or final judgments and must simply make a judicious estimate of the situation on the basis of available information. Unfortunately, the influence of this factor is so central and thus so all-pervasive that inability to be sure of the facts on this matter brings a fair amount of uncertainty into many other areas, such as, for example, the foreign policy of John Foster Dulles or the real significance of the so-called atomic espionage cases. Such uncertainty, however, is always present in historical analysis of the recent past, and most historians, knowing that the documents and thus the facts are unavailable for contemporary history, say the last 20 years, leave the most recent past to others, to political scientists, journalists, or biographers. In the history of the period of 1945 to 1963, there are 6 chief factors. 1. The Cold War and the nuclear balance. 2. Demobilization and remobilization with special emphasis on inter-service rivalries and the pressures from industrial complexes. 3. Partisan political struggles in the United States centering on the rise and decline of unilateralism. 4. Personal political struggles in the Soviet Union centering on the succession to Stalin. 5. Intra-bloc discords centering on the relations between the United States and its allies on one side and the relations between the Soviet Union and its satellites on the other side. And 6. The role of neutralism revolving around backwards nationalisms and anti-colonialism. The history of the period can be understood only in terms of the interplay of these 6 factors, in all their complexities, treated simultaneously. But before we attempt to do this, we must make a brief examination of each factor separately in order to define our terms and to establish secondary chronological sequences. The Cold War, as we shall see in the next chapter, was an inevitable consequence of the defeat of Germany, Japan, France, and Italy, and the collapse of nationalist China, but it was raised to an acute and sustained crisis by the existence of nuclear weapons and the development of rocket missiles. The combination threatened the survival of man as a civilized being, although it probably did not threaten his continued existence after a nuclear holocaust on a degraded social level as a distinct species of living being. The fear of human extermination was spread by many well intentioned, mistaken, or mercenary people and reached its peak perhaps in the commercial success of Neville Shute's On the Beach, both as a novel and as a motion picture. The annihilation of man, as shown in such works, is technically possible, but will certainly not result from the weapons which would be used in total thermonuclear war. However, there is always a remote possibility that a madman such as Hitler might decide to destroy the human race as revenge for the frustration of his insane ambitions. This could be done in a number of ways, of which the simplest would be to encase a large number of thermonuclear bombs in thick layers of cobalt. The ensuing fallout of radioactive cobalt 60 could extinguish all animal life on Earth, including most plants, insects, and other invertebrates. No sane policy would use such a bomb since cobalt 60 is 320 times as radioactive as radium, and it would require at least 400 such bombs, each at least 1 ton in weight, to release enough radioactivity to extinguish all animal life on Earth. However, even without a cobalt bomb, any extensive nuclear war would kill hundreds of millions of human beings and would release sufficient radioactivity to inflict such extensive genetic damage that subsequent generations of human beings would produce a substantial percentage of monsters. This fact, added to the genetic damage to bird life, might create a situation where men would be unable to compete successfully with insects. Where men would be unable to compete successfully with insects, who are much more immune to genetic damage from radioactivity. The balance of nuclear weapons is a central factor in the Cold War, since no agreement on cessation of nuclear testing, nuclear disarmament, conventional disarmament, or relaxation of tension can occur until both sides recognize that a nuclear balance of equilibrium, the so-called nuclear stalemate, had been achieved. This came close to achievement early in 1950 when both sides had atomic weapons, but was destroyed at that time by President Truman's order to proceed with the development of the hydrogen bomb. It was not achieved again until the end of 1962, because when both sides had achieved the H-bomb by 1956, that balance was distributed by the missile race, which reached its wildest disequilibrium with the Soviet success with Sputnik in October 1957. This led to the subsequent race to obtain an intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead, ICBM, in 1957 to 1962. By 1963, when both sides had these weapons, the balance of terror was established and negotiation was possible. As a matter of fact, the balance was not equal, since the American total capacity in nuclear war was far superior to that of the Soviet Union in 1963, but weapons development had reached approximately the same point. The United States was more vulnerable to Russia's fewer weapons because a larger part of its population was industrial and urban, and the Soviet Union had growing problems in other areas, notably its alienation from Communist China. At the same time, gross fissures began to appear in the Western Bloc. From de Gaulle's efforts to turn Europe out of the American camp and into a third neutralist force. About the same time, the Cuban crisis of October 1963, somewhat like the Fashoda crisis of 1898, by bringing up the United States and Soviet Union to the edge of war that neither wanted, revealed to both the mutual balance of terror and the need to do something about it. All this marked the end of the historical period, which began in 1945. The chief subdivision of the history of the nuclear balance over the period 1945 to 1963 are as follows. 1. The American atomic monopoly from Alamogordo in 1945 to the first Soviet atom bomb, Joe I, in August 1949. A brief nuclear balance from 1949 to 1950. 3. The race for the hydrogen bomb from January 1950 through the first American hydrogen fusion at Ein Wittok in November 1952, and the first Soviet H-bomb explosion of August 1953 to the American achievement of a practical thermonuclear weapon in March 1954. This contest continued for 2 more years as each side tried to perfect the new weapon as an aerial bomb. The United States made its first successful airdrop of a fusion bomb on May 21, 1956, almost certainly later than the comparable Soviet test. 4. The race for the ICBM from 1956 to 1962 has been widely misunderstood because propaganda falsehoods from both sides sought to conceal the true situation and often confused even themselves. Basically, the problem was, at the beginning, how to combine the American Nagasaki bomb, which weighed 9,000 pounds, with the German V-2 rocket, which carried a warhead of 1,700 pounds, only 200 miles. The Soviet government sought to close the gap between rocket power and nuclear payload by working toward a more powerful rocket, while the Americans, over the opposition of the Air Force and the aviation industry, sought to close the gap by getting smaller bombs. The result of the race was that the Soviet government required a series of very powerful rocket boosters ranging in thrust from 800,000 pounds to 1.5 million pounds and capable of hurling capsules from 1 to over 7 tons in weight. These were demonstrated to an astonished world from October 1957 onward. These Soviet successes in space made the American effort in rocket boosters look very second-rate, but this impression was rather misleading. It was perfectly true that the United States in 1957 to 1960 had no powerful rocket boosters capable of hurtling large space vehicles into orbit or past the moon, as was done with the 3,245-pound Soviet Lunik 1 in January 1959. But the United States in this period had a large number of fission and fusion warheads in great variety of sizes and was rapidly developing moderately powerful rockets able to carry these great distances. In fact, the first American ICBM was fired from Cape Canaveral in December 1957, 2 months after Sputnik 1, and went full range in November 58. By 1961, the United States had a varied assortment of missiles, both solid and liquid-fueled, some able to be fired in minutes and capable of carrying nuclear warheads whose explosive power was equivalent to as little as 750,000 tons of TNT, thus 43 times the force of the Hiroshima A-bomb, to 5 million or more tons of TNT. These could be delivered from distances from 1,000 to over 6,000 miles, and with such accuracy that at least half could be landed in a circle within 3 miles of a target. These developments left the Soviet Union with a much smaller number of giant rockets able to carry a 20 megaton, 20 million tons of TNT warhead, but so large that their locations were soon spied out by American high-flying U-2 photographic planes. To remedy this overemphasis on size, the Soviet Union in October 1961 broke the moratorium on nuclear explosive testing, which had existed since October 1958, and exploded a great variety of small bombs from 1 to 5 megatons, as well as a gigantic one of 25 megatons and a colossal one of 58 megatons. The latter, the largest bomb ever exploded, was equal to 1/3 of the total of all previous nuclear explosions from 1945 to the end of the previous testing in December 1958. Even before these final tests in 1960, elaborate calculations on the gigantic electronic computers in the Pentagon were estimating the consequences of a hypothetical total war in June 1963. The Whopper computer. From War Games. Two answers were: if the Soviet Union struck first and the United States retaliated, the war would be over in a single day with a Russian victory in which they lost 40 million of their 220 million population dead and 40% of their industrial capacity, while America would have 150 million of its 195 million people dead and 60% of its industry destroyed. 2. If the United States struck first with a nuclear attack in reply to a Soviet advance of ground troops into Germany, 75 million Russians and 110 million Americans would be killed, half of the industry of both would be destroyed, and neither could win. On this basis, some relaxation of tension became imperative as soon as the Soviets could be satisfied that they had achieved stalemate by their 1961 to 1962 nuclear tests. Closely related to this four-stage sequence of nuclear capability is the quite different four-stage sequence of strategic planning. This is concerned with what we plan to do as distinct from what we are able to do. From the American side, it has four stages as follows. 1. Great power cooperation within the United Nations Organization, 1945 to 1946. 2. Containment of Soviet expansion by all means available, including economic aid to others, the Marshall Plan, conventional forces as in NATO, and nuclear weapons, 1946 to 1953. 3. Liberation, massive retaliation, and the new look, 1953 to 1960. This period, associated with the influence of Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, sought to deal with foreign crisis by use of slogans and quite unrealistic policies which could never have been used. Our allies, the neutrals, and even the Russians, were ignored and often despised, while the State Department engaged in what Dulles himself called in January 1956, going to the brink of war. This policy sought to reduce government spending and balance the budget by reducing expenditures for all local or conventional wars, and to base our strategy and our foreign policy on the threat that any Soviet advance of any kind anywhere of which we disapproved would be stopped by our massive retaliation with all-out nuclear attack anywhere we judged appropriate on a unilateral, without consultation with our allies, and on our first strike basis. That is, we would do this even if the Soviet Union had not attacked us and had not used nuclear weapons. This policy was hopelessly irresponsible and not only alienated allies such as France and neutrals such as India, but could not be used since we would never adopt such suicidal and ineffective tactics to reply to a communist local advance in Korea, Southeast Asia, Tibet, Afghanistan, Iran, Egypt, Yugoslavia, or most other places on the periphery of the Soviet bloc. This policy abandoned NATO, in fact, if not in theory, and meant that we would have publicly adopted a policy we would never carry out, because even if we were willing to accept the full consequences of the Soviet nuclear counterblow to our massive retaliation, We could not ever win in such a war, since Soviet ground forces, with their 125 divisions in Europe, could easily overrun NATO's 25 divisions and would occupy all Europe except Britain and Spain. The Kremlin leaders moving to Paris or Rome, perhaps in the Vatican, would be beyond our reach and could hold London under nuclear threat, while both the United States and the Soviet Union were devastated. The dullest doctrine was not a doctrine of action, but solely a doctrine of threats, since it expected that the threat alone would stop Soviet advances and that it would never be necessary to carry out the threat. The policy worked in the sense that the world and the United States lived through it, only because the Soviet Union, at the same time, was in the interregnum between the death of Stalin, March 5th, 1952, and the accession to full power of Khrushchev, July 4th, 1957 to March 27th, 1958. Khrushchev. The last 2 years were occupied by the Eisenhower's administration efforts to get back to a more workable defense policy based on a variety of responses to Soviet actions, and to do so without either repudiating dulness or excessively unbalancing the budget. 4. Graduated deterrence. From 1960 onward was really an effort to get back to the policies of 1950 as advocated by the National Security Council paper NSC 58 of March 1950, and generally to the advice given by Robert Oppenheimer before his public career had been destroyed by the massive retaliation advocates in 1953. This revived doctrine called for a graduated and varied strategic response to Soviet aggression, combined with cooperation with our allies, recognition of the rights of neutrals to be neutral, increased economic and cultural aid to both groups, and relaxation of tension with the Soviet Union by cultural and scientific cooperation. This broad and varied program had at its core development of at least 4 levels of possible war. 1. War with conventional weapons. 2. Addition of tactical nuclear weapons. 3. Strategic nuclear attack on a no-cities basis, with attacks aimed only at Soviet military bases and installations. And 4. The total devastation response. Each of these had subgradations and gave rise to unsolved problems such as escalation, that is, the possibility that one level would develop gradually into a more intense level in the heat of combat. Moreover, such complex responses required immense outlays of money, even if the achievement of the whole was spread over many years. But this cost, it was felt, would be worthwhile, since nuclear warfare on a no-cities basis would save about 100 million American lives in the first week of war, in comparison with war on the total devastation level. One element in this whole strategic shift was the shift of the emphasis of our response from Strategic Air Command, SAC, nuclear bombing to conventional army forces and to the Navy's nuclear submarines with Polaris missiles. The former would reduce the temptation to the Soviet Union to instigate local brushfire wars, while the latter would be more successful in preventing any Soviet nuclear first strike, since such an attack would be much less able to find and destroy Polaris submarines than it would be to wipe out fixed SAC bases. All right. I think I'm going to stop reading right there for tonight. There's no chapter breaks in this, but now this last chapter, the New Age chapter, is just one of the most interesting chapters in the book so far, where they're talking about that how democracy failed after the nuclear bomb was developed, and that basically it's the precursor to all this like algorithmic stuff, and the fact that people will no longer be able to have enough knowledge themselves to make political decisions, and that their political decisions are now going to be made by mechanized, like algorithm based systems, and that their awareness is going to be subordinated to rigid group processes instead of them being individuals anymore, because everyone's afraid now, because the only people, because basically the government has become God, because now they have this bomb that can destroy the entire planet, and everyone knows it because they saw what happened to Hiroshima. So it basically reset the psychology of humanity from the Enlightenment period, where everyone was being equal because they all had access to the same level of weaponry that the government had. And then the atomic bomb or nuclear bomb, however you want to look at it, completely reset the balance of power in the world to now that the government has become God again. And then also the new government completely believes in subjectivity, diversity, equality, that everyone's an interchangeable cog in the machine, because now the scientists have taken over society, and now they view society as a machine that's just moving parts that people can be placed into and placed out of, and that the average person no longer needs to even be able to understand the political process, because it's all worked out by experts that have access to all the information that's running through society, all the algorithms. They set the algorithms, they set the political policies, they set the military policies, they build everything. And all you have to know how to do is do your little specified job. And you even knowing anything else is just like basically a mistake within the new system. Right. And that's where we are right now, where it's like gone to its logical conclusion, or the plan. More likely it's a plan that these people actually set out, because you can see it's going back to like the 1950s, that they're going to move towards this scientific dictatorship, technocracy, however you want to call it. It's basically the same thing. A scientific dictatorship, a technocracy, ruled by experts. Trust the science, and that you no longer have the right or the ability to make decisions for yourself, and that the decisions are going to be made top down, and that you just get in line or you get kicked out of the system. And now the new system is the only way to survive. So we will keep moving forward with this book tomorrow. We're on page 879. The link to the PDF is in the description if you just can't wait and you really want to get through it. Otherwise, thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you probably won't hear this. So have a good day and peace.